What begins here today will be a series of rapid-fire rants on the state of the contemporary comic book industry, or at least the rubble where it originally fucking stood. Its title, the unoriginal, inaccurate Comic Crash 2. Unoriginal because, come the fuck on, and inaccurate because contrary to the sudden explosion suggested by the word crash, the industry is instead dying a slow death of 1,000 fucking cuts. In order to have a crash, you first must have fucking momentum. If a Yugo runs out of whatever mixture of patchouli oil and snail grease those Eurotrash micro machines run on, sputters out quietly, then lists harmlessly to the side of the road, expiring in silence while afternoon traffic thunders by unimpeded, no one calls it a fucking crash. This is the malady presently afflicting the print comic industry. In 20 years, the market's gone from a bull to a bear, and compared to the slow withering contagion wasting away the industry's immune system at present, the original crash looks like Teddy fucking Ruxpin. What was the comic crash? Well, I've covered it before, so in all too brief summation, after a burgeoning direct back-issue market flowered into form in the 1980s, by the end of that decade, there were stores selling new product along with the old shit, effectively creating the comic book shop phenomenon overnight. With sister industry baseball cards commanding ludicrous prices, comics came along for the ride, and why shouldn't they? Notable firsts in Batman, Superman, and all other Golden Age regalia were sought after, and they were fucking rare. The vast majority ground into wood pulp for the war effort in the 1940s, leaving only a scant few in musty basements and dusty attics for preservation through the ages. And in an age before omnipresent reprints of original runs on these characters, you can understand why a first appearance of Joker comic commanded diamond-hard boner pill prices at auction. But if the 80s went into overdrive, by the dawn of the somnambulate 90s, the collector's market greed machine had gone full-on fucking Megatron. In short, the industry caught on to the collector's comic craze and began printing, in googly-eyed gold foil lettering, "First issue collector's items. Sell your kidney now and put your kid through college with this comic in the fucking future." And then they printed 90 tetrillion copies of Tampon Man #1, forgetting that the entire reason Golden Age comics were collectible to begin with was that you hadn't printed enough copies of the fucking thing to line Rodin's birdcage with. The result? The comic book crash of 1993. What happened? Well, Marvel filed for bankruptcy in 97, and DC probably would have followed suit if they hadn't been saved from a similar bankruptcy situation by parent company Warner Brothers years fucking previous. It was a sad nadir for the so-called House of Ideas, the fortress that first emerged from the ashes of timely comics on the back of pioneering work from the creative Stan Lee and his stable of equally creative collaborators. Jack Kirby, John Romita, Wally Wood, Steve Ditko, Jim Steranko, John Buscema, Gene Colan. The advent of the Marvel method meant instead of the strictly scripted stories seen at rival DC Comics, where writers steered the ship and artists simply did their bidding, Stan Lee would instead generate the concept of the story, hand over the basic story beats, let the artist effectively author and illustrate his own story, then Stan the Man would fill in and letter the precise verbiage after the fucking fact. It was a revelation, cutting turnaround time in half and giving artists a greater sense of authorial satisfaction as stories hit the stands with their signature style front and fucking center.
Stan didn't have enough time to script all of these things in advance, otherwise he would have. So what he did was he would verbally or quickly dash out a half a page plot and send it to the artist. Mostly it was verbal, I think, just for time's sake. And the artist then would decide what to make a splash scene and how to introduce the characters and how to unfold the story, which was at first terrified me. But almost immediately, maybe in a month or two, I realized, holy mackerel, this is a much better way to do it. Comics succeeded despite doing it the wrong way. It should have always been done visually. Once we made it a visual medium, two things happened. Every artist had his own approach to storytelling, so you had more variety instead of having a writer's personal approach. Secondly, Stan Lee discovered that after he had the silent drawings, he could now add balloons where he didn't expect to be able to add them. Sound effects could come anywhere he wanted. So he gained freedom, we gained freedom, albeit we gained a lot of time-consuming responsibility, but it also was much more gratifying, and we were able to put our stamp on the thing, and it was wonderful. If anything made comics boom, I think it was that that accident of expediency.
Look, I won't bore you with the history of the entire comic industry, but suffice to say, Marvel caught lightning in a bottle, bogarted that shit, and bled DC dry for the next 3 decades. To give you an idea of how dominant Marvel were by the late 60s, when an editorial edict decreed all DC covers would have a check print pattern atop the upper fifth in order to distinguish themselves at retail, the result instead was that customers were looking at the racks, spotting the check print banner, immediately realizing it belonged to DC Comics, and reflexively buying the Marvel book instead. Now, here they were in '97, 5 years removed from releasing the highest-selling comic of all time, X-Men #1, dying in a goddamn gutter and nearly purchased by their rivals at Warner, and Michael fucking Jackson, if you can believe it. Say what you want about Joe Quesada, but he helmed a night and day turnaround that ushered Marvel back to the top of the charts and ultimately the box office as well. What few discuss is that he did so largely by upending the Marvel method. After the 90s had been characterized by artists who became outright fucking superstars, regularly featured on late night TV and fucking sitcoms, whether they had actual talent in tow or not.
This is out there, Youngblood. He's the man behind the nation's best-selling comic book, folks. Just out on the stands today. It's called Youngblood, and here's its creator, Rob Liefeld. Rob!
The Marvel of the aughts instead gave itself back over to the writers. In lieu of rock star pencilers adorning every cover of Wizard magazine, scribes like Bendis, Ellis, Ennis, and others became the driving force for a slow recovery in comics, while the Jim Lees, Frank Millers, Rob Liefelds, and the like, and their bloated butt-fucking egos, fled for DC Comics and did terrible things.
Well, what happened with that following artists is that artists became like superstar artists, and then it got into this weird area where the artists had totally taken over every aspect of the creation of the comic, and everything was big double-page spreads and, you know, and tons of bats and flowing capes and chains and there's a great tradition in comics of the splash page. You turn the page and boom, there's the shot, and then it became every page was the boom, there's a shot, boom, there's a shot, boom. There's no story. It was just, and no matter how great the drawing is, if the comic is only about that drawing, it's a very shallow experience. What we're in now is very writer oriented, and what you get there is, from the most basic level, the what's attracting to the comic book is an idea or a series of ideas, and that's so much more captivating than a pinup.
By 2007, comic sales were soaring, but seemingly far more sustainable than they had been in the 90s. Look, as a former employee of a comic shop from around this time, I can confirm shelving stacks upon stacks of Marvel's Civil War and selling the fuck out multiple times. And DC's Infinite Crisis in 52 weren't far the fuck behind either. Both companies were kicking several kinds of ass, but Marvel in particular had repossessed themselves. But then something happened. Well, 2 things, actually. First and foremost, the industry got a housing crash to go with their comic one they'd only recently recovered from. Now, that might seem like a somewhat irrelevant detail, but with unemployment up over 10% when pennies need pinching and it's time to cross shit off the monthly goddamn grocery list, name an item more tempting to remove than a stack of monthly comics with a cover price creeping toward $5. Secondly, there was their success at the cinema, Joe Quesada's increasing involvement in it, and resulted editorial alterations. Here I could choose any comic as an example, but Daredevil's my fucking favorite, so goddamn deal with it. When Marvel went bankrupt, Daredevil was damn near unreadable. He was palling around as a secret fucking S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, pretending he was French, and oh hey, did I mention he could fucking see? Well, when Joe Quesada assumed the reins at Marvel, whether out of personal loyalty to the character or simply because he figured, hey, if I can fix this piping hot fucking mess, we can fix absolutely anything at Marvel, Quesada made Daredevil the centerpiece of his new editorial direction, enlisting the writing talents of Kevin Smith and the art talents of himself. Daredevil #1 exploded onto the scene and ushered in an entirely new direction for the company at large, one that carried over into Ultimate Spider-Man, New X-Men, and other massive hits, all arcing in the same creative direction. While it may never be the biggest seller at the company, the creative rule of thumb was established that where Daredevil goes, so goes Marvel. So I would hope you understand the import that Marvel's next move in the mid-teens was to let Mark Wade reimagined the character as a happy-go-lucky, smiling swashbuckler bandying pop culture snark between bad guy of the week bullshit. After the moody malevolence of Alex Maleev and Michael Lark's noir-tinged illustrations, the art was also overhauled with Chris Samney and Paulo Rivera's unshaded line work and loud pastels replacing Marco Cicchetto's darksome renderings. It ate dick. No one bought it. It was the lowest selling run since the relaunch, but the press pounded it in the pooper to completion, so we were stuck with it for 5 fucking years. No, this isn't me using any excuse at all to bellyache about Wade Devil. This is me pointing out that at this time, Daredevil tended to steer the stylistic direction of Marvel at large, and it devoured 12 forklifts of fucking dick. The Wade Devil influence was immediate and eternal. Suddenly, instead of chasing sales with their entire lineup, only Marvel's Star Wars shovelware and increasingly forced fucking events were meant to actually generate income, leaving mainline Marvel books to languish in hot pink side-shave CalArts cringe for the foreseeable future. Art got uglier and uglier, writing went from woke to woke in all caps. The socio-political proselytizing on Mark Waid's Daredevil, which honestly began at a low rumble and raised to a full-on fucking roar by the end, was felt on every fucking book in the company. And when 2016 hit and we added Trump derangement syndrome to the equation, forget about it. By the midpoint of the decade, Cap was Hail and Hydra, Thor had a muff, and after decades of unblemished heterosexuality, Iceman became a walking fucking Family Guy gay joke. My point in laying out all this history is so you can understand. The recent tendency among comic critics on YouTube and elsewhere is to bemoan the state of modern Marvel by characterizing it as a mere side effect of the post-2016 culture war in the world at large, when in actuality, the first shots were fired by Mark Waid in 2011, DC having done so long the fuck before that. Hell, you could argue Brian K. Vaughan's Ultimate X-Men reducing Colossus to a homoerotic caricature presaged the wokening to come. Point is, this ain't nothing new. Both companies have been slowly embracing socio-political preachifying, confusing their own tombstones with a pulpit for a fucking minute. All the 2016 MAGA cost did was expedite the fucking lunacy, from which Chip Zdarsky's Daredevil run ironically appears to be the exception. Which brings us to 2020. With DC going down in flames and Marvel more valuable as a film property than a printed product, Marvel Comics is now the Vegas odds-on favorite to next perform a Hindenburg fucking landing, and all of it beneath the umbrella of the slow disintegration of printed magazines as a going concern to begin with. Enjoy your smart device eye strain, retards! But it begs the question, can the Scheissberg be avoided? When really the better question is, should it? Marvel was once a hothouse of untrammeled creativity, a collision point for unencumbered creative minds to clash, spar, and sharpen each other's skills. Consider the bullpen of the 60s. Romita, Wood, Ditko, Lee. Now look at the leering Daria extras and circular soy-tards inhabiting the bullpen of the present. Given his Ayn Randian politics, by the time Ditko died, I doubt he was allowed in the fucking building, let alone as a working artist for Marvel. And he co-created Spider-Man, for fuck's sake. How many would-be Ditkos, Sterenkos, and Romitas are you shrieking ideologues turning away at the goddamn gates because their voter registration card has the wrong fucking letter at the end? Hell, Mark Waid is canceling other companies' comics because the talent told an edgy joke on Twitter an eon fucking previous. What hope do aspiring artists have, particularly with a dwindling pool of openings? There is a time and place for affirmative action. A flaming fucking dumpster, for example. But let's not pretend the company that let Rob Liefeld in the front door before he could draw a human fucking foot has lease for gatekeeping. I'd sooner station Mr. Magoo with a water pistol on my property than the same company that let RD and Siaf insert anti-Semitic Muslim propaganda into the fucking X-Men. If you're letting Saddam have a parking pass, who the fuck were you turning away? Oh, that's right, the readers. Truth hurts, bitch. Invest in a fucking cup. I'm Razor Fist. God fucking speed.
Try to explain our thinking on how we're coming across and why we're doing Overkill the way it is.
You can think and draw at the same time?
Yeah, what was the process back then? I mean, because Rob and I right now, we do our own writing and our own drawing. We don't collaborate with anybody anymore, so...
That's the problem, and I've been meaning to talk to you guys about that. Incidentally, you guys have ruined us. We've decided to give up comics and we're going into showbiz.